this project started in 2015 as an idea between me and Yang, and it was sort of a question like, could we make something in this community that Yang grew up in? And I was an outsider too, but I had lived in Montana, and that's where Yang and I met. And it kind of, because Yang thought it would be a good idea, perhaps, we embarked on this journey, and it was many years of developing the story, and bringing everyone else on board, and figuring out what the right story would be, and really like what the community was interested in too. We brought the idea for the film to a kind of public meeting with folks, and that was a really important, I feel like, turning point for the project, and finding out kind of like, what seemed to matter and what so far in the writing resonated or didn't. And so that was kind of the first part of it, and then I'll hand it over to Yang to kind of. How else did we make it happen?
So during this time, I had moved to Minnesota, and that's where I also during the time I met Melissa, and so we were creating films on our own level, just short films in Minnesota, and that's how Melissa really got involved, just because she was a filmmaker, but she was also living in a community with Hmong people at a larger capacity than it was in Missoula. And we just really wanted to have like all the, we just really want to have different expertise in different communities to bring forth into Bitterroot. But then I can hand it off to someone else, because we then met along the process. Like Keejin, we met because we worked on a different project together, even before knowing that we were going to work on Bitterroot. But we were attached to the project already at the time, and then we all just met through that.
What about can you talk about the meetings, or that you had in Montana?
Oh yes. So during I believe it was 2019. This is when we really wanted to kickstart this film, really go into pre-production and then production. But we really had we went back to Missoula just to have conversations with the Missoula Hmong community about this film. We really wanted the community to be involved, so we really wanted to make and create this authentic film and story that the community approved of, and also stood alongside us through the process. And so that's what we did multiple times. And then I also went through the casting. We really wanted to make sure that we had genuine people to represent these very real characters in the world of Bitterroot as well.
Actually, I would love for you to touch more on the casting process. Are most of the actors professional, non-professional? What was it like for you to kind of first cast this film, and also the process of working with the actors, if they're a mix of?
Okay. Cool. Hi, everybody. My name is Melissa Vang. So the process for the casting is that we already know that it's going to be a non-traditional way of how you would typically cast for film, because the actors or the talents are not trained to be on screen, and they also live a different life outside of the film, theater, the arts. We've been fortunate that the way we were casting is that we also knew we need to go to the pockets of the Hmong communities and ask, who's there, who's our elders, who has that voice, who can really yell at you like a mom, and it hurts. Who's there as the uncle who can, tell you they're concerned but really not reprimand you, and who can be the voice, and it's not so much the look. I think there's an idea that Vera had, and so we do have multiple ways of how do we cast, but what we did is we went to the elder centers and we started looking in those spaces of who had characters, and trust us, they're amazing. They have so much stories to tell, and so you just can't help but feel if I can cast you in everything, you would be in it. But it's also who can bring life to song, who can bring life to sorry, Wah can't do himself. Wah is our main character for Lu, but who can help these characters come to life on screen. And so we've been fortunate enough that we found Q and Wah. And Wah is actually an actor from Minnesota who actually moved out here to California, lived in LA, did that whole actor life, but then realized that, there's not a lot of opportunities for a Hmong American actor who can try to play other Asian Americans. And so he decides to now be a nurse practitioner where he gets more money. So that's great. But the thing about it is that he's so talented that he was willing to come in and also help us with that. And the thing about these casting is that we also want to make sure that when we went back to Missoula, that we built that relationship for them to come on set and not be like the background, but actually be the community that they are there. That they can be who they are, and then just like, and then the biggest thing is taking time to let the folks know what does a set look like, what does it sound like, and how does it operate, so it doesn't intimidate them in a way that they feel like they're not in the space that they're welcome. So that is also a step that we took when it comes to like our larger casting for the extras.
And I'll also add that we did a table read as part of the Montana Film Festival, which is a festival in Missoula, and that was a few years before we shot, and that was kind of a way to not only have this workshopping of the script, but also to kind of connect with folks there. And so we had people who ended up in the film from the Hmong community there in the various roles for the table read too. So.
And it really feels like everyone in the film, which is so naturalistic on screen, that I wouldn't have been able to tell. These are untrained actors. So I'm curious for you to direct and film a blend of professional and non-professional actors. If there was any specific direction that you were giving, or any way that you were choosing to frame different faces and characters, like what was that like for you?
I really loved how Melissa phrased it, bring life to what we're capturing. I think that was generally my idea for the image side of it. Largely working with available lights, but it's like you can say lighting on object or subject, but I think subject can catch light that's there. That was my approach. Just like, I think if you try hard, I think you can see spirits as well. So that was my approach. So like in some ways, I just wanted to be inspired. The best way to go about it at times, I think it's not doing much, but being inspired.
Yeah, and you can see we didn't have a huge amount of coverage for our scenes, and I think that helps also, right? You're not kind of moving the camera around people a bunch, and you have a setup where people can get used to the spatial relationship, and I always knew that the lead needed to have some acting experience. We were so lucky to find Wah, who is an actor. And if we could get, the mom and the son who could really, have some range and really like go places, hard places emotionally, that the rest would kind of come together, right? So it's really, it feels really special, kind of how we brought these kind of two families together, of like folks from out of town and folks in town, and that was kind of one of the most gratifying things to hear about how the production experience was for our cast too. That and for our crew from Minnesota who came in, like that people felt so connected with each other, and like, oh, this is another Hmong community. But like we don't necessarily know everybody, although some people, there's always connections between families, but that folks really like were welcomed in by the community and felt a part of the place too. So
And earlier you touched on spirits, and I would love for you to kind of touch on that aspect of the film a little bit more. It shows up in quite a few places, the wearing of or not wearing of the amulet, and sort of there's a specific scene that I was reading kind of is very spiritual, and maybe we can unpack a little bit when Lu went moral picking and sort of saw an image of himself and asked his father for help, and sort of magically April Charles' character shows up to help him. And so I'm curious more about the spiritual aspects of the film, if you want to talk.
I mean, this was one of the biggest pieces of the story, yes, and kind of the work that went into developing in the writing. And I think for me, it's, this film is so much about connection between people, but also between, worlds, really. And so how to kind of like bring that thread through of touching on this traditional Hmong spiritual belief, right, of the spirit world that is alongside our material physical world, felt like a crucial part here. So the ways that we wove that in with sound, with this moment of confronting a piece of yourself, right, was, I guess, it was a delicate balance, and but ultimately for me, as like the writer and director, so much about the same theme that's coming up in different ways in the film of connecting between places and a way towards yourself and your community through connection. Do you want to add anything about the spirit?
Yeah. So I think to Vera, a lot of the critical notes I give her is like, don't educate the audience, allow that spiritual world to exist in this narrative, and people will figure it out. If they have to watch it multiple times, that's great. But what it is that it's something that requires more than just watching it once and asking a director those questions. It's actually about talking to the community, talking to people who you might not be comfortable with, or you don't know anything about, or you're ignorant of like practicing shamanism, but for specifically in the Hmong American community. So the way how that's depicted has been conversation. So it's not just a one question solution. And that's also a conversation between, even with Kijin, how the camera works and how does that play with showcasing Lu's spirit. And how do you understand, and this is also Vera's, like her research, her work that she had to do for herself in understanding Hmong shamanism. And so when I asked, and a few of us, like even from the Missoula community, I remember sitting in that conversation where they're like, well, how do the non-Hmong people audience understand? And I think we came back with a thing is like, do they really understand it, or can Lu live in this screen, in this world, in this movie, with his spirits, with him still, like in whatever that relationship is for him? And I think that those are the things we ask, and I think the solution's on the screen, and it was really about figuring out along the way, but it was never about a direct, we know what we're gonna do, or Vera, you're like, hey, this is what it is, because I still remember having that conversation up in the mountain where I'm like, hey, spirits are probably naked. Like, I don't know, do spirits wear clothes? Or are they in the clothes where they fall or they die? I don't know, like, what is that? And then when I went back to my mom, I'm like, hey mom, like, how do you know this, what the spirits look like? She's like, one point it was like, oh, when his spirit probably like, they probably were in the clothes when they had a traumatic experience, and that's the outfit they wore. And I'm like, I thought about it, and I'm like, wow, being a human is very fascinating, because for me, I think it makes more sense for them to be naked, but clothing is the material, right?
And Wow was grateful.
Yeah, well, our actor was grateful. He's like, yes, there's clothes.
And, I'm also curious about the kind of different gender dynamics, too, in the film, sort of the relationships between male and female characters. Curious if you wanted to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I early on, so this kind of touches on the casting process too. When Gia Vang, who plays the sister, and I had an initial conversation about casting, she asked me, why tell a story about a man? and I told her my honest feeling about it is like, I think we can make a feminist story about a man, and with the man at the center, and have this about kind of the ways that we give care and accept help. To me, those are really feminist-oriented concerns. And it was really moving for me as we rehearsed and connected with Q, who plays the mother, and more conversations with Gia about how they saw themselves or saw their family members in these roles, in these dynamics. So, yeah.
I think there's a special sensitivity to the depictions of him, singing the same song over and over at karaoke. Why that song? What is the significance? What's going through his mind and his heart when he sings that?
I mean, I love to leave that open for folks to kind of reflect on. I can tell a story about how, we decided this was the right song. There was a lot of sort of work about what song it was going to be, and then it came down to 2 songs, and Yang and I were sitting in the car in Missoula doing it after a scout and trying to make this decision. And and Yang said, well, I asked, what do you feel is the difference between these 2 songs? And when you said this song, right, every time feels like being kind of trapped in this loop, I knew, okay, this is the song, right? This is kind of not only does it tap into the Gen X, or the generational kind of connection that folks of a certain age would know this song, but really that the lyrics of leaving and kind of in this loop in the structure of the song felt really poetically connected to what we're trying to do in the film.
So what was the other song that you were considering?
I can't even remember what it was right now.
Was it a Toto song?
Mm-hmm.
So,
It was a Toto song.
do you remember?
Yes.
We shouldn't say, but there were only 2
sorry.
songs we
Scratch that.
Yeah.
And I would love to throw it out to the audience. If anyone has any questions, raise your hand. Don't be shy. Feel free to ask something. Yes.
Thank you so much for bringing such a compelling story to life. I could really feel this quiet care in every facet of the filmmaking, in that translation from spiritual to physical. I think I really felt it in the soundscape, especially. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more on the vision behind the sound and the music.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the sound and the sort of universe of the soundscape outside of the frame was always an important part of kind of the vision for the film. And one of the exciting parts of the editing process, and then of course working with the sound designer, Tim Korn, that's also sort of. I think that we often think that score is what is coloring the emotions of the soundscape, right? And it's absolutely true, but I really believe that ambience can be emotional too. And so thinking about those atmospheric sounds and the way that they describe space and the way that they kind of inform the feelings that a character is having. Every time Lou goes to the river, the water sounds a little bit different. And that may be something that you notice with repeated viewings. But that was something in the care, thank you for using that word, in making these choices. That it was one of the really exciting parts to me of making this.
And along those lines, I just want to thank you for offering closed captioning as well on this film. I was able to test out the device during the screening, and there was, descriptions of the soundscape that you were naming. So some of the descriptors being droning, hopeful music, sounds of truck on gravel, things like that. Is just want to plug that there is a list of films available at SDAFF with closed captioning. We invite you to look at that list on our accessibility page. on SDAFF.org to learn more. But any other questions from the audience? Yes, in the middle there.
I took the story as a tale of perseverance in a bleak existence, and when it ended, I read it as a happily ever after story. And do I have an overactive imagination?
I feel like we all need that overactive imagination right now. It is like this open-ended ending, right? But for me, like being togetherness is like a very hopeful thing, and that we need each other. And so that is such a big part of this film for me. So I'm happy if you have a hopeful feeling at the end of the movie.
While we kind of see if there's any other questions in the audience, I would love to ask those of you who are helping with kind of distribution of the film, what's next? Where is it traveling to? What are you working on? Just love to learn more about where this film is headed.
Yeah, we're wrapping up on festivals, and we're gonna bring it straight to the community. That's our goal. That's always been our plan, because I think the question every filmmaker has is, who's your audience? And it's not a business marketing strategy, it's just really, who is your audience? And when we said that it is the Hmong community, specifically the Hmong Missoula, because if they didn't like this movie, you guys will not be here. But it's also really the Hmong community across the US, and it's really then those who have a similar experience, Southeast Asians, then they stretch out to Asian Americans, and then moral hunters, and then fish, those fly fishers. You can nitpick and say specific, but the core of it is the Hmong community, so we are excited to bring it to the community. And what does that look like? We're figuring it out. But all we know is that they're like you, they're like me. We watch everything on our devices. So what is our way to get that into their hands, and how can we excite them with this amazing story that hopefully will fuel more filmmakers and storytellers to feel brave and courageous to tell more stories?
Feel free to raise your hand if anyone has another question. But I am also curious about the inclusion of April Charles' character, the one who was chopping wood and watching this big fancy house while sleeping in a trailer. Just curious about, the choices there with that character and how she shows up, and kind of this thing that she's doing in the woods, right? Like watching this house for this family who doesn't even live there in the community.
I think every film of mine is a way to think about belonging and what it takes to belong, who's in, who's out. And my first feature film that I made, also in Montana, was about a white woman who was this itinerant English language instructor, and then her international students that she worked with. And thinking about this landscape and who lives there and who lived there first and who came later, and these sort of layers of belonging that are really in the land, in the West, in this whole country, but the West is sort of like this place to think about American belonging. I wanted to kind of look at this situation, right, where we've got an Indigenous woman, and April is an important piece of casting her is that she is Bitterroot Salish, so the native tribe that is actually from the area where we were filming, and her people, her lineage is that place in a really deep way, and but Native history is full of displacement and genocide, and yet people are still there. So I wanted to have this character who was like navigating her belonging, right, and her connection, but dealing with the realities of making a living, dealing with things that happen in your life, right? That's really sort of like in the background, like unstated, explicit, but surviving, right, and persisting and being there, and so the idea that she would connect with a more recent person who belongs in Montana felt important to think about, again, like connection, solidarity, belonging, who belongs here, right? It's kind of a long answer for you.
No, thank you for sharing. And I do have a question for Karen, actually. Earlier you had mentioned that this was the first time you're in person with this group. So I'm curious what it's like for you to produce remotely, as you kind of shared a little bit earlier.
I don't recommend it remotely. I mean, I guess we've all gotten used to remote work, but producing is, what I love about filmmaking is the collaboration. So the remoteness of it kind of takes that away. But it was always how I knew I would have to participate in this project. Like, I think one of the first things I said was, I already know I'm not going to be able to be there on set. So it's the first film I produced where I wasn't on set like every day, every minute. So that was tough, but I did what I could, and we all played multiple roles. Like, I think I was the production accountant and then did the tax incentive, and now we're working on the distribution together, and so it's super rewarding. But it was, a film like this, when I was the last person on the producing team to come on, and I already knew Vera, was a fan of her work, I was a fan of Keejun's work, and now huge fan of Yang and Melissa and being able to work with them. But really my job was to figure out how to help the film meet the market. And as a producer, it's like there are so many budgets you're working with, right? There's the budget of like the script as it's written, and there's the budget that's the number that the risk that the film can take in the marketplace, which right now for independent films is so tough. And then there's the number, which is the amount of money you can raise as a producer and as the producing team. And you want to get those numbers to be equal. Those three numbers have to be the same number in order to make the film. So I think throughout the whole process, that really was my job, and we got to a place where I think we've reached some really interesting innovations in the way that we finance the film. This film is completely financed through non-recoupable funding, and a lot of that was driven by the idea of not like art funding or film funding, but workforce development funding. And so, to keep making films like this, so that we can see stories and see communities and hear languages that we still haven't yet in our 100+ years of the history of cinema. It's like that work is just as important. But yeah, it's not as fun as being there in person.
Thank you. And for Keejun, my question for you is, you had mentioned this is the first time you're seeing this on the big screen. So what was that experience like for you?
I was actually very moved. Well, our work is one thing, but I think I felt fortunate to be able to connect with all of these wonderful, talented collaborators. And I still think about my best moments on set. I was hanging out with the community members, drinking, eating, being asked if I was married, which was an honor. So those memories came back when I was, in the end credits roll, when I saw their names. That really made me probably extremely proud of what we've achieved together.
Thank you so much. Any other questions from the audience? Yes?
I don't have a question, and I don't have a fully formed statement. Just as sort of, I'm gonna get emotional. As an Asian American person growing up in this place in the West, I've been searching for films or depictions of people who look like me in spaces that you created in this film. There's something to be said about the way that you were able to depict the characters' relationship to the land, but also the characters taking up space and inhabiting those kinds of spaces that we don't get to see very often in film or in general on TV or anywhere in the media. And so that part really came for me as somebody who watched, Legends of the Fall and a river runs through it. I'm like, I love these spaces in these films, and I want, to feel even more connected to what I see on this film. So that part I'm deeply grateful for, but also to hear the process, the such thoughtful, conscientious process of putting together the story with the community. As a non-Hmong viewer who has my own experience, as a Southeast Asian refugee, to think about that single line of, we're not going to teach you, we're going to live it, we're going to have you sit with it, we're going to have you live it. That was so key in creating such a depth as a viewer for me that I just, after he asked for his dad's help, I was like tears in the eyes for the rest of the film, because you just felt the depth of what that meant in that moment. It wasn't trying to depict it for anyone else but the people who understand the depth of what that meant for that character in that moment and for the community. And, so this is not a question, just a deep, deep gratitude for this really important work that honestly I've grown as a person having watched it, which is what I always look for when I watch films. So thank you so much for everything, for the teamwork, the awareness, the conscientiousness, the community groundedness, everything. So
I think that's a gorgeous place to end. Thank you so much for your comments.